Hi, my name is Koral Lusz. I'm going to be telling you today about a research paper I did last semester. Actually, in Dr. Prescott's class, she was the presentation before the last one. So it's called The Psychology of Obedience and Following Authority, an attempt at explaining the Holocaust. I would like to start by saying thank you for coming this afternoon, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a senior here at PBA, and I graduate in 44 days. I will be graduating with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology with a minor in English. With that degree, I hope to continue my studies at the highest level in the field of psychology starting within the next year. So now that you know a little bit about me, today I want to tell you about an important issue from our past and how that plays into the lives of the generations in this room. I'm sure that everybody here has heard of and is at least somewhat familiar with the Holocaust that happened back in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. As you can imagine, the mental and emotional, not to mention physical, toll this event took on the survivors and their families is incomprehensible. In fact, it still affects the lives of those who have a connection to it to this day. The effects of the Holocaust were and still are largely immeasurable. However, scholars and psychologists such as Charles Hoffling, Stanley Milgram, Solomon Asch spent decades attempting to understand the immensity of the Holocaust in order to provide reasoning for the capacity to which a human can carry out a crime so horrendous. Questions about human good versus evil, the motivations behind the brutality involved in this event, and how a person could harm another person voluntarily and willingly were major topics of study in the mid-1900s. So today, I hope to provide somewhat of an explanation of what happened in the Holocaust through a psychological perspective, and hopefully provide some insight into the impact this event still has today. The extermination wasn't a careless or accidental act. It was actually quite a successful and thorough plan. After the devastation came to light, a few questions arose in the discipline of psychology, particularly in the United States. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about some of the concepts of human nature and the psychologists who studied them. I would like to begin with the idea of obedience. This is defined as a form of social influence where an individual acts in response to a direct order from another individual, which is usually an authority figure, according to most dictionaries. So this is the act of doing something because somebody of authority told you to. We all know what this means. However, the key here is that somebody of authority is involved. An example of this is through a man named Adolf Eichmann who was involved in the Holocaust. He states in the Guardian newspaper, a British newspaper, in 1999, quote, "The orders were, for me, the highest thing in my life, and I had to obey them without question," end quote. After being on trial for the crimes he committed as a Nazi leader, he said that. The judge who sentenced him said, quote, "His crimes are of unparalleled horror in their nature and their scope," end quote. However, he claimed he was shocked to learn that the Jewish people hated him because he was simply following orders, and clearly and surely obeying orders could only be a good thing. 6 psychologists had evaluated him before the trial and determined him to be of a sane mind and completely sound judgment. Back to the topic of obedience, we find our first study. Charles Hoffling wanted to test his concept in the early 1960s with an experiment that observed what nurses in a hospital would do when given instruction by a doctor over the phone to administer medications to patients. On 22 occasions, a fake doctor who was in on the experiment made calls to unsuspecting nurses asking them to administer 20 milligrams of a drug named Astratin. The problem was the maximum dosage of this drug was only 10 milligrams. They were forbidden to accept instructions over the phone, and the nurses were forbidden to have access to this drug as well. So the results showed that 21 out of 22 nurses tested were easily influenced and carried out the instructions given by this doctor. This may seem simple, but I believe it provides some insight as to how people behave when they think that they are just simply following orders given to them by somebody higher than them. This implies that a common person would follow orders simply because they believe they're following authority. They would not disagree or question whether their actions were right or wrong or harmful or not. The fact that this experiment was conducted in a real environment lends even more credibility in explaining how average people obey those they believe are superior to them. So this leads to the next concept, and that is the tendency to follow authority. Having authority means that you have the ability to influence others, either directly or indirectly. The man who studied this also in the 1960s was known as Stanley Milgram, and you may know who this is or are familiar with this study. He wanted to test how far common people would go when following authority, even if it meant hurting somebody else. In an interview, he stated, quote, "Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible and destructive process," end quote. His purpose for conducting this seemingly harsh experiment was to find some sort of justification for acts of genocide, particularly the Holocaust. He asked young men volunteers to come to his lab to either be teachers or learners, but it was already previously determined who was going to be who. He already had colleagues of his that were going to be the learners and who were going to conduct this experiment in the same room. So the learner wouldn't actually be anybody, but it would be a voice recording. The teacher, being overseen by one of Milgram's colleagues, was instructed to ask the learner questions, and for every wrong answer, the teacher was to administer a shock. The catch is there was no actual learner, but it was a voice recording, as I mentioned, and so this was to give the illusion that there was a real person that was going to be receiving the shocks. This learner would be in a different room. The teacher couldn't see them. So for every wrong answer, the voltages increased, and then eventually they became lethal. The voice recording would respond with cries, pleading, and eventually silence as the voltages increased. So the point here was to observe how far a completely normal person would go when following authority, despite knowing they were harming somebody else. Even if the teacher asked if they could stop the experiment because they were uncomfortable, they were prodded to continue with the questions. 65% of participants continued administering shocks to the highest level of 450 volts, which was lethal. 100% of participants continued to 300 volts. Milgram concluded the men continued simply because Milgram's colleague was standing over them, over their shoulder, giving them the idea that he was in control and he had authority over them, and they would be wrong to resist his commands. Next, I would like to tell you about the concept of cruelty. Last semester when I was taking this class, I wrote this research paper in it. Our teacher asked us to form groups for a discussion. Within our group, she asked us, "What kind of questions do you have heading into this class?" I could hear people around me say that they couldn't believe something like this happened. How could someone let this happen? And it made me think about those questions and write this paper. Cruelty is something that has been a major topic of discussion for centuries for people all across disciplines. The first indicator of cruelty in the Nazi era was the consideration of that Jews were subhuman creatures on the same level as rats. This idea of racism and dehumanization is not a new concept if you pay attention to the world we live in. In a psychology dictionary, cruelty is defined as detachment from or voluntary impression of damage, pain, sadness, or other kinds of tangible mental and emotional hardship. The next experiment I want to tell you about was called the Bystander Apathy experiment, which was conducted by two men named John Darley and Bib Latane. So let me explain to you what the Bystander Effect is. In 1964, a woman was murdered in front of her home, and there were 38 witnesses. Not a single person did anything to help this woman as she was being stabbed and assaulted. This is called the Bystander Apathy Effect. In this experiment, the experimenters gather recruited volunteer college students, and one student will be placed in a room under the impression there were between 1 and 5 in a different room, each of them connected to speakers so they can listen and talk to each other. The experiment continued as one pre-recorded voice tells the others he's epileptic. During the progression of the experiment, he starts having seizures. The object of this experiment was to see how long it would take a participant to stand up and seek out a facilitator for help. In this experiment, 31% of participants got up to look for help. When it was perceived that there were more people around, there was a lower percentage of reactions in people to look for help for the boy they thought was having an epileptic seizure. This is an interesting low percentage of people who would actually get up to go look for help when they experience somebody having something so life-threatening. The phenomenon seems to portray that people are more embarrassed or too apathetic to break social norms and go against what everyone else is doing. It is harder for one person to turn against the trend of what others are doing around them, even if they know someone is being harmed. Lastly is the concept of conformity. The experiment that touched upon this was called the ash line test experiment, which was conducted by Solomon Asch in 1958. He wanted to test to what extent people would be influenced by social pressure from a majority group. He gathered 50 male participants and proctored a line judgment test. He asked 7 people at a time, and 6 of them were Confederates of his who were in on the experiment, and the last person was just a test subject. They were presented with a card that had 4 lines on it, A, B, C, and then X, and X was the control line. The experimenter asked the participant to determine out loud which line they believed would be the closest link to X, A, B, or C. Each person was asked individually what his or her answer was, and the tested participant who was not in on the experiment was asked lastly. The purpose of asking the unknown participant last was to see if he would be influenced by the other answers after hearing them before his was given. The key was the first 6 participants were instructed on each answer they were supposed to give. They were told to answer incorrectly in 12 out of 18 trials. Each answer was obvious. Asch wanted to see if the last person would conform and say the incorrect answer or not conform and say the correct answer that they knew was correct. The results found that 32% of the time, each participant conformed to a majority view, and over 75% conformed at least one time, even though they knew the answer was wrong. Again, this experiment seems way too simple, but it's truly inspiring and surprising. Each of these experiments clearly demonstrate how people would unknowingly and unconsciously conform to fit in with others around them so as to not stick out. Each of these experiments proves people will do things they think that they would not do. So why does this matter? Each of these human behaviors may not be particularly found in every single person. However, it can be deducted that they were perhaps stronger in the German society at the time things began changing. Adolf Eichmann was perhaps the most notorious for his strict obedience, comparatively loyal like a dog. Others like him acted in the same way. Perhaps the Holocaust was so successful because all the small components fit together to give way. Perhaps the Holocaust was so successful. With Hitler rising to power at just the right time, his anti-Semitic attitude that influenced so many people around him, and the economic instability and general poor morality in Germany at the time, all these different things accumulated and simply continued without much force acting against them. The stereotype of Germany's authoritative attitude, obedience to authority, and strict disciplinary culture at the time simply fueled the Nazi regime. Yes, destruction of this magnitude seems like it is so far from human that there couldn't possibly be any valid reason for it. I hope that you all take away that I am by no means justifying anything that happened during World War II, and I'm not justifying cruel, unfair human behavior, but I simply cannot understand why something like this happened, and doing this research has helped me. After I finished this research project, I began to view my everyday life with these concepts in mind, and so I started to see patterns forming. I don't wish to go off topic or create any unnecessary tension in the room, so I will end on this note. Genesis 1:26 and 27 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make a man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." If you can step back and see the things that fed the climax of millions being murdered, such as economic turmoil, resentment towards a political leader, racism, violence, war, and conformity, how can one not be surprised that this earth-shattering event took place? Are there any questions? Thank you. Oh. Okay. So his question was if I had any prior connection to make me want to study this. I took this class, the class was called Major Writers of the Holocaust. I took it last semester with Dr. Prescott, and I've always been really interested in it, and I'm studying psychology here. So she had us write this term paper at the end, and she was like, you can write it on whatever you want to write it on, and that's where I got the idea. I love psychology, I love studying it, and I loved that class, so I thought, why not just integrate them both?
So, how do you think this could be used in Christian circles when we
I think so. I think as Christians, I think a lot of us can get so caught up in our own bubble, and we can, I mean, especially like being surrounded on a Christian campus, and it's so easy for us to say, oh, like, you know, that stuff is happening overseas, and, you know, that stuff is like not affecting me, and I don't have any connection to that. But, you know, we as Christians are supposed to be lights, and we're supposed to be leaders, and it's easy for us to be leaders in our own bubble too, if that's, you know, what you want to do. And I think that we're just supposed to love people, and we're supposed to be like Jesus. And if that means, I don't know, like, if you see issues going on, you know, stand up for it and speak out about it. And that's just basically what I'm trying to do. Thank you.